The part 2 of the location of the real Jerusalem. In this part 2 series we gonna exposed and go into detail to show what the European nations did to hide and conceal the real location of where the true biblical location was located and who the real people of the book really are. But before we can go into the evidence we first have to go look at the maps that was documented by the cartographers during ancient times. In 1886 the cartographer G. W. Colton documented the map of southern Africa showing where the location of Jerusalem was located. As you can see on the map, even 2 other smaller towns was documented that is mentioned in the Bible. Jerusalem is the place where Jesus was brought as a child, to be presented at the temple, Luke 2 verse 22, and to attend festivals, Luke 2 verse 41. According to the Gospels, Jesus preached and healed in Jerusalem, especially in the temple courts. Bethany is recorded in the New Testament as a small village in Judea, the home of the siblings Mary of Bethany, Martha, and Lazarus, as well as that of Simon the leper. Jesus is reported to have lodged there after his entry into Jerusalem. Beersheba, biblical town of southern Israel, now a city and the main center of the Negev, in Hebrew, Ha-Negev, in Arabic, Al-Nakab, region. Beersheba is first mentioned as the site where Abraham, founder of the Jewish people, made a covenant with the Philistine king Abimelech of Gerar, Genesis 21.
This is the historical, the biblical, the scriptural, the authentic, the Jerusalem of history. This is the real one, the one that went through the 70 AD destruction by Titus Vespasian. This is it here. This is how it look. This is its shape. This is its topology. This is Jerusalem, the one of history. And upon immediate view of Jerusalem, we can see and tell that this is the real Jerusalem that fulfills prophecy. Jeremiah chapter 9 verse 11 says that Jerusalem and Judah are supposed to be desolate and uninhabited. And that is what we're looking at here. This Jerusalem is as scriptures say that it is. This is it here. What we are looking at is the burntness, the residue of Jerusalem, of the destruction of Jerusalem. This is it here, the real one. This is our city. This is our land in Judah, Namibia, southwest Africa, in the Karis region. This is how it look here. Now this is not the one located in the Middle East. This is not that. That one, that's Hadrian's Jerusalem. And that Jerusalem is a fraudulent location. That's like Universal Studios is built on a studio. Universal Studios builds sets for their movies. That's exactly what the Middle East is. A studio set. This one here, this is history. This is historical. This is authentic. This is the real, the scriptural, the biblical Jerusalem that is properly called Agasimba. This is it here, how I look. Let's go through Jerusalem and take a look and see what remains, what is left. And this Jerusalem here has been kept hidden from the people, the original black Jews. This has been kept hidden for hundreds of years. The land, the promise, and the people. All of that stolen, confiscated, and kept hidden by the
There is a total of 39 Jerusalems globally. We can eliminate 37 of them and focus on 2 Jerusalems. The 37 Jerusalems are not historical nor authentic, they are cities that merely bear the name Jerusalem, hence they can be eliminated. That leaves 2 Jerusalems, where one of these is the real, the historical, the authentic, the biblical, the scriptural Jerusalem, and the other one is fraudulent, fake, is Hadrian's Jerusalem, built on a studio set. Like Universal Studios, they build sets for their movies.
Still be protected from your arrows. They're genius. And then they could use a ram to strike against the walls of Masada.
Prepare the catapult. Destroy it! No!
As Josephus said, Jerusalem was thoroughly laid. Now it did not happen exactly that way, and the characters, particularly the Jews, they are the wrong color. The Jews are black, not white. Nonetheless, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome under the command of Titus Vespasian, fulfilling the prophecy of Jeremiah, chapter 9 verse 11. This is Hadrian. He was a Roman emperor from 117 AD to 138 AD. It was Hadrian that put the final nail in the coffin on Jerusalem. In 132 AD, Hadrian campaigned to erase Jerusalem and Israel and Judah and anything associated with them out of existence, out of history. It was Hadrian that kick-started the cover-up of the original black Jews, their identity, their land and cities, their scriptures and history. After the turbulent history of Jerusalem, with the last two major destructions, where exactly is Jerusalem, and how does it look?
Many people have been wondering where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is located in the center of Israel, which is in the Middle East, right at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea.
The story begins in 750 BC, when the Near East was divided into many small kingdoms and city-states. They were wedged between the Assyrian Empire to the north and Egypt in the south. Among them was the Kingdom of Israel, whose people worshipped several gods, including Yahweh.
Founded in 1948, the State of Israel is located on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea.
We're going to go over here, and I'm going to show you where Israel sits on the African tectonic plate, which means that Israel is northeast Africa. Now, when we look at this map, this is the Sinai. Okay, this is the Red Sea. This is Egypt. This is the Sinai. This is Israel. All right, this is Saudi Arabia over here. Now, if you see this in Hebrew, it says Haluach Afrikani. The African plate. Here it is right here. Israel is sitting right here. Israel is sitting on the Haluach Afrikani, which means that Israel is northeast Africa. Europeans classified this area as the Middle East. You know, and then since this is the Middle East, the other question, where the Middle West? Where the Middle North and where the Middle South? They don't have no geographical terms like that.
Is Jerusalem really in the Middle East? According to scripture, Jerusalem is supposed to be desolate and uninhabited. The idea of a Middle East begs the question, where is the Middle North, where is the Middle South, and where is the Middle West? This only makes the concept of a Middle East fraudulent at best. So where is Jerusalem? What is its true location? Region Font Code 3. Region Font Code 3 says, Jerusalem is in Africa and the Middle East. Africa is huge, very vast, so exactly where is Jerusalem in Africa? This is Ptolemy, a geographer and cartographer. Ptolemy wrote about another geographer named Marinus. Ptolemy wrote how Marinus took an expedition to Africa, to the interiors of Africa, past the equator, below the Tropic of Capricorn, and came to a land called Agisimba. Agisimba is Bantu, it means land of the lion, which could only refer to the tribe of Judah. The scriptural, the biblical, the historical, the real Jerusalem is located in Namibia, southwest Africa, in the Karas region, near Keetmanshoop. According to Josephus, Jerusalem is huge, it's 33 furlongs, that's 4 miles. Jerusalem was a very big hill city in the land of Judah. This is Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem. This is the residue of Jerusalem after the 70 AD destruction by Titus Vespasian. This is what is left of Jerusalem. What we are viewing is the authentic, historical, scriptural, and biblical, and the real Jerusalem. The one we find in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. This is it, this is how it looks, and this is its topology. There is so much more to cover. Let's begin with region font code 3 that says Jerusalem is in Africa and the Middle East. There are 39 places called Jerusalem in the world. There are 2 more Jerusalems in Africa, but we can eliminate them along with the others because the topology, rivers and mountains of Israel are not in those locations. Also Agisimba is not in those locations. Psalms chapter 83, verses 4 and 5, it reads, "They conspire against your people, plot against those you protect. They say, 'Come, let us wipe them out as a nation, let not the name of Israel be remembered anymore.'" Do you remember him? This is Hadrian, Emperor of Rome. He is the one that got the cover-up started. The cover-up of the original black Jews, covering up their identity by seeking to wipe them out of existence. Covering up their land and cities, their history and scriptures. Covering up anything associated with them by changing, altering, hiding, hijacking, forging, moving, removing, and replacing truth with lies and deceptions. After the destruction of Jerusalem, Titus Vespasian sent Legion Exfrontensis to guard Jerusalem and to guard Judah. The Bar Kokhba revolt was the spark that got Hadrian so outraged that he sent more Legion Exfrontensis and other Roman soldiers to guard and wipe out all cities of Judah, Benjamin, Reuben, Simeon, and all of Israel, along with the scriptures, the Torah, and anything associated with Israel and Judah. Legion Exfrontensis garrisoned Jerusalem from 66 AD to 217 AD. As time went on, the Roman army became the Byzantine army, and Jerusalem continued being guarded, continued being empty, desolate, and uninhabited. If the real Jerusalem is in Namibia, Southwest Africa, then whose Jerusalem is in the Middle East? The Jerusalem in the Middle East is Hadrian's Jerusalem. Hadrian was so outraged at the Bar Kokhba revolt that he decided to punish and insult the original black Jews by moving Jerusalem to a province of Rome. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, also known as the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, was the most important temple in ancient Rome, located on the Capitoline Hill, i.e. Capitol Hill. This is where the United States gets its Capitol Hill from. Capitoline is the daughter of Babylon. The Wailing Wall is the original wall of the Temple of Jupiter. The Jerusalem in the Middle East is the Aelia Capitoline, the Temple of Jupiter, daughter of Babylon, disguised as Jerusalem and financed by the United States and Great Britain and other countries. In case you are not convinced of Jerusalem's true location in Namibia, Southwest Africa, we will turn our attention to the Dead Sea. This is a picture of the Dead Sea, one in the Middle East and one in Namibia, Southwest Africa. The one in the Middle East is a copy of the one in Namibia. It is the work of a copycat, a forger, and a hijacker. It is criminal behavior. But we must ask ourselves, how do we know we have correct information? In answering this question, let's take a look at some old maps. These are maps of Hecataeus, Homer, and Herodotus. Look closely at the area called Middle East. Notice there is no record of Jerusalem, no Israel, no Dead Sea, no Sea of Galilee, no mountains of Israel. These are not recorded as existing in this location during the time of Hecataeus, Homer, and Herodotus. They did not exist in the so-called Middle East area during their day. So how did they get there, to the so-called Middle East? They got to this region by the hand of a copycat, forger, and hijacker. Hijack means unlawful seizure of property and removing it to a different location for use for one's own purposes. The Dead Sea was hijacked, the Sea of Galilee was hijacked, the entire land of Israel was hijacked. Jerusalem was hijacked. Such hijacking makes the Middle East a fraudulent location. What you are viewing is how to build a man-made lake. The fake Sea of Galilee and the fake Dead Sea in the fake land called Middle East, which is nothing more than a studio set, was constructed in a similar fashion. This is the biblical, the scriptural, the historical Dead Sea, the one we find in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. The Dead Sea is an ancient landmark that authenticates other geographical locations, cities, sites, mountains, and rivers in Judah and Israel. This is the biblical, the scriptural, the historical Jerusalem, the one founded by King David after he defeated the Jebusites, the one where Jesus roamed, the one where the disciples roamed, the one where many historical events happened, to Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, and around Jerusalem, the one that we find in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. This is our city. This is our land. This is Jerusalem. This is Agisimba, the land of the lion, kingdom of Judah, in Namibia, Southwest Africa, in the Karas region. This is the real Jerusalem.
Meanwhile, the Jews were at it again, about to throw yet another revolt. Led by the proclaimed Messiah Bar Kokhba, he promised to retake Judea by any means necessary. He gathered his fanatical Jews, slaughtered the local Roman garrisons, and retook Jerusalem for themselves. When the local legions tried to restore peace, they were pushed back by 500,000 rebel Jews. Bar Kokhba purged Judea of all non-Jews, Romans and Christians alike, along with their wives and children. When news of the massacre reached the emperor, Hadrian went mad. He sailed for Judea, followed by 12 legions, and started killing every single Jew he found. No mercy was showed, no quarter given. Hadrian would settle with nothing less than the complete destruction of Judea.
After the destruction of Jerusalem, Roman Emperor Hadrian's reign in 132 to 136 CE, when Jerusalem was completely destroyed and the Jewish nation was massacred in large groups at a time, with the result that they were even expelled from the borders of Judea. Jews were expelled from the area of Jerusalem. All of a sudden, July 4, 325, was a memorable day. About 300 Christian bishops and deacons from the eastern half of the Roman Empire had come to Nicaea, a little town near the Bosporus Straits flowing between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The emperor, Constantine the Great, entered the hall in his imperial, jewel-encrusted, multicolored brocades, but out of respect for the Christian leaders, without his customary train of soldiers. Constantine spoke only briefly. He told the churchmen they had to come to some agreement on the crucial questions dividing them. Division in the church, he said, is worse than war. Everything was working perfectly. The master planned to hijack the Holy Scriptures and loot from Namibia, South Africa, and shift them to the Roman Empire to form the Bible and the fake Jerusalem in the Middle East.
Here comes the different types of Bibles that were all translated from the original scrolls that was looted from Namibia, South Africa, and the original location of Jerusalem. The Codex Sinaiticus, Greek Old Testament and Greek New Testament, supposedly founded in 4th century after 325 AD. Script Greek found at Sinai, 1844, another Bible, the Codex Vaticanus, designated by Siglum B or 03, Delta 1, is a Christian manuscript of a Greek Bible, containing the majority of the Greek Old Testament and the majority of the Greek New Testament. It is one of the 4 great uncial codices. The Codex Vaticanus, designated by Siglum B or 03, Delta 1, is a Christian manuscript of a Greek Bible, containing the majority of the Greek Old Testament and the majority of the Greek New Testament. It is one of the 4 great uncial codices. Wikipedia. Original language, Greek. Date, 4th century. Another Bible, the Great Bible of 1539, was the first authorized edition of the Bible in English, authorized by King Henry VIII of England to be read aloud in the church services of the Church of England. The Geneva Bible is one of the most historically significant translations of the Bible into English, preceding the King James Version by 51 years. It was the primary Bible of 16th-century English Protestantism and was used by William Shakespeare, Oliver Cromwell, John Knox, John Donne and others. The last version of the stolen scrolls and manuscripts was finally translated to the King James Version. Also, the King James Bible, and the Authorized Version, is an early modern English translation of the Christian Bible for the Church of England, which was commissioned in 1604 and published in 1611, by sponsorship of King James VI and I. With Portugal's expansion into Western Africa in the 15th century, Iberian merchants began to recognize the economic potential of a large-scale slave trafficking enterprise. One of the first to record this sentiment, according to Portuguese royal chronicler Gomes Enes de Zurara, was a young ship captain named Antônio Gonçalves, who sailed to West Africa in 1441 hoping to acquire seal skins and oil. After obtaining his cargo, Gonçalves called a meeting of the 21 sailors who accompanied him and unveiled his plan to increase their profits. According to Zurara, Gonçalves told his crew, "We have already got our cargo, but how fair a thing would it be if we, who have come to this land for a cargo of such petty merchandise, were to meet with good fortune and bring the first captives before the presence of our prince?" That night, Gonçalves led a raiding party into Cap Blanc, a narrow peninsula between Western Sahara and Mauritania, and kidnapped 2 Berbers, 1 man and 1 woman. Another Portuguese mariner, Nuno Tristão, and members of his crew soon joined Gonçalves. Although the raid resulted in less than a dozen captives, Zurara imagines in his account that Prince Henry of Portugal responded to this enterprise with joy, not so much for the number of captives taken, but for prospect of other, countless, captives that could be taken. While Gonçalves' voyage in 1441 is widely considered to mark the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade, it may also be viewed as an extension of an older tradition of raiding and ransom on both shores of the Mediterranean. Upon returning to Portugal, Gonçalves treated his captives in accordance with this custom, and allowed them to negotiate the terms of their release. Rather than offering a ransom of money, the captives promised to give Gonçalves 10 slaves in exchange for their own freedom and safe passage home. According to royal chronicler Zurara, the Berbers explained that these new captives would be black, and not of the lineage of Moors, but Gentiles. Thus in 1442, Gonçalves returned his Berber captives to Western Sahara, receiving as payment 10 enslaved sub-Saharan Africans, whom he then transported back to Portugal for resale. 15th-century Iberian legal traditions regulated Christians' treatment of Jews, Muslims, and other Christians, clearly delineating, for example, who was enslavable and who was not. In contrast, the juridical status of people who did not fit these categories was more ambiguous. Legal and philosophical arguments to address this issue began to evolve during the second half of the 15th century, once Portuguese mariners began to return to Iberia with captives acquired in West Africa and West Central Africa. Notably, the treatment of black Gentiles was addressed in 1452 and 1455, when Pope Nicholas V issued a series of papal bulls that granted Portugal the right to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. Church leaders argued that slavery served as a natural deterrent and Christianizing influence to barbarous behavior among pagans. Using this logic, the Pope issued a mandate to the Portuguese king, Alfonso V, and instructed him to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. After the map of 1886 from the cartographer G. W. Colton, a new map was published from 1890s not showing the location of Jerusalem and the other towns that was mentioned in the biblical times. Why? The colonizers changed everything to hide and maintain the sinister plan to conceal the crime and lies they about to unveil upon the whole world, the identity theft and relocation of the real Jerusalem. Identity theft, identity piracy or identity infringement occurs when someone uses another's personal identifying information, like their name, identifying number, or credit card number, without their permission, to commit fraud or other crimes. The term identity theft was coined in 1964. In 1884 the master plan was unveiled in Germany. Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 meeting at which the major European powers negotiated and formalized claims to territory in Africa, also called the Berlin West Africa Conference. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 marked the climax of the European competition for territory in Africa, a process commonly known as the Scramble for Africa. During the 1870s and early 1880s, European nations such as Great Britain, France, and Germany began looking to Africa for natural resources for their growing industrial sectors as well as a potential market for the goods these factories produced. As a result, these governments sought to safeguard their commercial interests in Africa and began sending scouts to the continent to secure treaties from indigenous peoples or their supposed representatives. Similarly, Belgium's King Leopold II, who aspired to increase his personal wealth by acquiring African territory, hired agents to lay claim to vast tracts of land in Central Africa. To protect Germany's commercial interests, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was otherwise uninterested in Africa, felt compelled to stake claims to African land. Inevitably, the scramble for territory led to conflict among European powers, particularly between the British and French in West Africa, Egypt, the Portuguese and British in East Africa, and the French and King Leopold II in Central Africa. Rivalry between Great Britain and France led Bismarck to intervene, and in late 1884 he called a meeting of European powers in Berlin. In the subsequent meetings, Great Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and King Leopold II negotiated their claims to African territory, which were then formalized and mapped. During the conference, the leaders also agreed to allow free trade among the colonies and established a framework for negotiating future European claims in Africa. Neither the Berlin Conference itself or the framework for future negotiations provided any say for the peoples of Africa over the partitioning of their homelands. The Berlin Conference did not initiate European colonization of Africa, but it did legitimate and formalize the process. In addition, it sparked new interest in Africa. Following the close of the conference, European powers expanded their claims in Africa such that by 1900, European states had claimed nearly 90% of African territory.
The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a pivotal event in the history of Africa and European colonialism. At the time, Africa was a continent rich in resources, and the scramble to claim territories and exploit its wealth was intensifying among European powers. The conference, convened by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, aimed to establish ground rules for the division of Africa among these powers to avoid potential conflicts. However, the conference was far from a fair and just negotiation between African nations and European powers. The African leaders were not invited to participate, and decisions about the division of their land and resources were made without their consent. This blatant disregard for African sovereignty and self-determination had far-reaching consequences that still resonate today. The arbitrary borders drawn during the conference fragmented African societies, leading to the eventual colonization of the entire continent and the exploitation of its people and resources. The Berlin Conference serves as a stark reminder of the dark legacy of European imperialism and the lasting impact it has had on Africa's history and development.
The Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade involved the transportation by slave traders of enslaved African people, mainly to the Americas. The outfitted European slave ships of the slave trade regularly used the triangular trade route and its middle passage, and existed from the 16th to the 19th centuries. All this Bibles and the transatlantic slave trade were connected in some way to conceal and hide that Africa was the holy land of the Hebrew people. The Roman Catholic Church played a huge role in the cover-up and concealment. Soon after the Berlin Conference in 1884, they unveiled another sinister plan to genocide the remaining black Hebrews in the region of Namibia, South Africa in 1904 till 1908 to further push the agenda of concealing the master plan. The Herero and Namakwa genocide, or the Herero and Nama genocide, was a campaign of ethnic extermination and collective punishment which was waged against the Herero, Ovahero, and the Nama in German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, by the German Empire. It was the first genocide to begin in the 20th century, 5, 6, 7, occurring between 1904 and 1908, 1. In January 1904, the Herero people, who were led by Samuel Maherero, and the Nama people, who were led by Captain Hendrik Witbooi, rebelled against German colonial rule. On January 12, they killed more than 100 German settlers in the area of Okahanja, 8. In August, German General Lothar von Trotha defeated the Ovaherero in the Battle of Waterberg and drove them into the desert of Omahik, where most of them died of dehydration. In October, the Nama people also rebelled against the Germans, only to suffer a similar fate. Between 24,000 and 100,000 Hereros and 10,000 Nama died in the genocide. 9. The first phase of the genocide was characterized by widespread death from starvation and dehydration, due to the prevention of the Herero from leaving the Namib Desert by German forces. Once defeated, thousands of Hereros and Namas were imprisoned in concentration camps, where the majority died of diseases, abuse, and exhaustion. 10, 11. In 1985, the United Nations Whitaker Report classified the aftermath as an attempt to exterminate the Herero and Nama peoples of Southwest Africa, and therefore one of the earliest attempts at genocide in the 20th century. In 2004, the German government recognized and apologized for the events, but ruled out financial compensation for the victims' descendants. 12. In July 2015, the German government and the Speaker of the Bundestag officially called the events a genocide. However, it refused to consider reparations at that time. 13, 14. Despite this, the last batch of skulls and other remains of slaughtered tribesmen which were taken to Germany to promote racial superiority were taken back to Namibia in 2018, with Petra Boss-Huber, a German Protestant bishop, describing the event as the first genocide of the 20th century. 15, 16. In May 2021, the German government agreed to pay €1.1 billion over 30 years to fund projects in communities that were impacted by the genocide. 1.
It's known as the Forgotten Genocide, and it was carried out during Germany's brutal occupation of Namibia. Prior to colonization, a number of indigenous groups such as the Herero, Nama, the Damara, the San, and many others lived in Namibia freely. In 1884, Germany formally colonized German Southwest Africa. It began confiscating indigenous land and stealing cattle. Indigenous people were also used as slave labor to till their own stolen land. As the occupation of the land continued, life became unbearable for many indigenous groups. In January 1904, a group of Hereros led by Chief Samuel Maherero carried out a rebellion against German settlers. 123 colonists were killed. The German military took up arms against the Herero, who did not have the weaponry of the Germans. By June 1904, the Hereros and Germans were negotiating a surrender. But this all changed when Germany appointed Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha. He abandoned negotiations and surrounded the Herero, killing between 3,000 and 5,000 Herero fighters. Despite this, many of the Herero managed to escape and tried to flee across the desert to the British Protectorate in modern-day Botswana. But Trotha ensured the military pursued Herero men, women, and children. Many were shot to death, poisoned through drinking water in wells, or died of thirst and starvation. But it didn't stop there. In October 1904, Trotha passed an order to kill every Herero man, armed or unarmed man, on sight, and to shoot at women and children. Thousands of Herero were murdered in cold blood. In November 1904, the order was overturned. The surviving Herero population was to be transferred into concentration camps. Herero women were subject to sexual violence and rape. The concentration camps had poor hygiene, little food, and used forced labor and medical experiments. Some historians estimate that the mortality rate was between 50 and 70%. In 1905, another group called the Nama rose up against German colonists. The conflict lasted 2 years. People from the Nama were executed or incarcerated in camps with the Herero. Historians estimate that 50 to 65,000 Herero, or 80% of the entire population, and 10,000 Nama, or 50% of the entire population, were killed by the Germans. For many years, Germany acknowledged there were atrocities but ruled out any compensation. In 2018, it returned human remains to Namibia, which were used in widely discredited research proving the racial superiority of Europeans. After 5 years of negotiation with the Namibian government, in 2021, Germany finally acknowledged that it committed genocide during the colonial occupation of Namibia, and agreed to provide development funds of $1.34 billion over the next 30 years for infrastructure, health, and training. Germany says it will not make individual payments, pay reparations, or compensate survivors. But many activists say it's too little, too late.
Soon after the Herero and Namaqua genocide in 1904 till 1908, here comes the Balfour Declaration. It was a public statement issued by the British government in 1917 during the First World War, announcing its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, then an Ottoman region with a small minority Jewish population, the establishment of the fake Israel and Jerusalem in progress.
We are proud of the role that we played in the creation of the State of Israel, and we will certainly mark the centenary with pride.
This was what Theresa May had to say about the 100-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. But what exactly happened on November 2nd, 1917, and what was the Balfour Declaration all about? These 68 words were a historic promise given to the early Zionist movement by the British government for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Sir Arthur Balfour, then Foreign Secretary of Britain, wrote in a public letter to a famous British Zionist, Lord Walter Rothschild, which read,
His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
This was just what the Zionists were looking for, as outlined in the First Zionist Congress during its meeting in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. Earlier, Theodor Herzl, their founder, had failed to realize this purpose when he couldn't get support from the Ottomans or any other European ruler. But this declaration basically laid out the foundation for the State of Israel. And since the second part of the agreement, where it talks about protecting the civil and religious rights for non-Jewish communities in Palestine, was never implemented, it resulted in a great injustice towards the Palestinian people, as thousands of them lost their homeland with the creation of this new Jewish state, and the ones who remained are being treated like second-class citizens. I think the late British author and journalist Arthur Koester summed it up best when he said, "One nation solemnly promised to another nation the country of a third." What were they thinking? Well, you see, Great Britain was in the midst of World War I, and one of its biggest foes was the Ottoman Empire. So they employed the tried and tested strategy of divide and conquer. They were giving the Arabs the promise of complete and final liberation in return for rebellion against the Ottoman rulers. The Crown had decided Palestine's for the Jews, thus ensuring a perpetually divided Middle East. And 31 years after the Balfour Declaration, the State of Israel was founded. But it's not 100% certain that this was the initial goal of the British government. The results have brought devastating consequences to the Middle East. It paved the way for the longest military occupation in recent history and destabilized an entire region. So should the UK government be proud of this landmark letter? Or should they come to terms with the reality of what it's done?
Here comes the Holocaust, the genocide of European Jews during World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators systematically murdered some 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe, around two-thirds of Europe's Jewish population. All this was connected the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 132 to 135 CE, the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the so-called discoveries or translations of different Bibles and scrolls, manuscripts, Codex Sinaiticus book, the Codex Vaticanus in the 4th century, the Great Bible 1539, the Geneva Bible 1560, the King James Bible 1611, the Atlantic slave trade 16th to the 19th centuries, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, the Herero and Namaqua genocide 1904 to 1908, the Balfour Declaration 1917, the Holocaust 1941 to 1945, everything is connected. The master plan is in full effect, almost done.
Hitler introduced laws that limited the freedoms of Jews. They were banned from going to public places like cinemas and shops and from traveling on public transport. When out in public, Jews were ordered to wear a yellow star, a Jewish religious symbol, so that they could be easily told apart from non-Jews. The Nazis told Germans that those wearing the star were enemies of the people. By 1938, Hitler had developed a more extreme policy, and the Nazis planned a night of violence against Jews called Kristallnacht. Attacks were made on shops and properties owned by Jewish people. Synagogues were burnt down, and some Jewish people were murdered. During World War II, Nazi Germany invaded and conquered much of Europe, which gave Hitler the chance to impose his racist plans on European Jews. Hitler ordered a rounding up of Jews, as well as other groups he hated, including gay people, Roma gypsies, and people with disabilities. They were arrested, sent from their homes, and imprisoned in concentration camps, where they were forced into slave labor in inhuman conditions. The deaths of millions were caused by starvation and disease. The Nazis designed everything so that concentration camps would be places of immense suffering. Inmates were faced with horrendous overcrowding and were made to share tiered wooden bunk beds. Up to 12 of them were crammed into each bunk, with hundreds of people in each room. Conditions were so dirty that infestations of rats were the norm. Washing and toilet facilities were limited or non-existent, so in these overcrowded, squalid conditions, disease spread easily amongst the prisoners. Hunger was an even greater problem. The Nazis fed inmates barely enough food to keep them alive. Meals would be a piece of bread or perhaps a watery soup made from vegetable peelings. Those fit enough to survive these conditions were forced into hard manual labor. Those not fit enough to work would be killed. Millions died because of the brutality of life in concentration camps. But the Nazis built other camps, known as extermination or death camps. In these, they deliberately murdered millions of people.
The master plan is completed with the establishment of Israel in 1948. The Israeli Declaration of Independence, formerly the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel, was proclaimed on May 14, 1948 by David Ben-Gurion, the executive head of the World Zionist Organization, chairman of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, and soon-to-be first Prime Minister of Israel, at the same time of the creation of Israel, the same region where the real Jerusalem was located. Apartheid 1948 to 1994 in South Africa was the racial segregation under the all-white government of South Africa, which dictated that non-white South Africans, a majority of the population, were required to live in separate areas from whites and use separate public facilities, and contact between the two groups. Everything was by design and the master plan was completed.
The creation of Israel in 1948 is a seminal event in the history of the Middle East. To understand its genesis, it's imperative to go back in history and consider the amalgamation of socio-political events, the religious significance of the land, and the dire circumstances of the Jewish people in the aftermath of World War II. Jewish ties to the region known today as Israel date back several millennia. According to biblical tradition, the Jewish forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived in this region, which was then called Canaan. Centuries later, the Exodus story tells of Moses leading the Israelites from Egyptian bondage back to the Promised Land. This biblical connection has long imprinted a spiritual connection between the Jews and this geographic region. Over the centuries, various empires, Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman, controlled the land, causing a dispersion of the Jewish community worldwide. Yet, a continuous Jewish presence remained in the region, and the dream of returning to and re-establishing a sovereign Jewish homeland, an idea known as Zionism, persisted. In the late 19th century, the Jewish nationalist movement, Zionism, gained momentum under the leadership of people like Theodor Herzl, who envisioned a modern Jewish state as a refugee from anti-Semitism and as a place to revitalize Jewish culture. Herzl's book, The Jewish State, 1896, is a foundational text for this movement. The early 20th century saw the British and the Ottoman Empire embroiled in World War I. With the fall of the Ottoman Empire post-WWI, Britain gained control over Palestine through the League of Nations mandate system. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, issued by the British government, expressed support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. However, Britain's mandate in Palestine was fraught with challenges. While Jewish immigration increased, so did Arab opposition to a Jewish state. Arabs in Palestine viewed the influx of Jews as an infringement upon their national rights. Thus, a complex and bitter struggle between Jewish and Arab national movements ensued. World War II and the Holocaust played a significant role in the urgency for a Jewish homeland. The genocide of 6 million Jews brought to light the vulnerabilities faced by the Jewish population in Europe. The displaced survivors and the global shock over the revelations of the Holocaust created international sympathy for the establishment of a Jewish state. Post-war, Britain found itself unable to devise an acceptable solution to the Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine recommended partitioning the land into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. This plan was ratified by the UN General Assembly as Resolution 181 in November 1947. The Jewish leadership accepted the UN partition plan, but it was rejected by the Arab states and the Palestinian Arab leadership. The rejection was rooted in a belief that the entirety of Palestine was rightfully Arab territory, and that the Jewish state's creation would dispossess Palestinian Arabs. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, head of the Jewish Agency, proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. This declaration came on the eve of the expiration of the British Mandate. Almost immediately, Israel faced military challenges. Neighboring Arab states, opposed to the creation of Israel, initiated military interventions. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, often termed the War of Independence by Israelis and Nakba catastrophe by Palestinians, ensued. By the end of the conflict in 1949, Israel had not only defended its territory, but had expanded beyond the boundaries set by the UN partition plan. The creation of Israel is deeply intertwined with millennia of history, modern nationalism, colonialism, and the tragic events of World War II. Today, Israel stands as a homeland for Jews, but the circumstances of its creation continue to reverberate in regional politics, particularly in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The story of Israel's creation highlights the complexities of national aspirations, the dire consequences of global wars, and the challenges of carving out a state in a region steeped in millennia of history. Both the Jewish and Palestinian narratives are essential to understanding the broader context, and while Israel's establishment is celebrated by many, it's also a period of profound loss and displacement for Palestinians. Thus, as with many historical narratives, the creation of Israel is multifaceted and deeply impactful.
On April 27, 1994, Nelson Mandela cast his vote in the first free and democratic elections in South Africa, marking the official end to racial oppression and apartheid rule. Apartheid, a term we've heard before, but what exactly is it? The word itself stems from the South African dialect of Dutch Afrikaans and literally means apartness. But for millions in South Africa, it held a much darker reality. It was a system put in place by the Afrikaner National Party in 1948, which allowed for lawful segregation using racial divides.
Will you intensify your present policy of racial segregation?
The policy of, what do you mean by intensify? Whether any further measures are to come, it's impossible for me to say at the moment. I do not know of any.
The policy governed South Africa for nearly 50 years, but racial segregation existed long before apartheid even began. In 1913, the government passed the Natives Land Act, limiting black African land ownership to 7% and restricting them from buying or occupying land except as employees of a white master. More than 3 decades later, the practice of systematic racial segregation was given the name apartheid and was extended under the government led by the National Party. The party's goal was to separate South Africa's white minority from its non-white majority, in addition to separating non-whites from each other. They did this by putting in place hundreds of race laws touching every aspect of life, preventing equal opportunities for basic human rights to people of color, including dictating where they could live, work, go to school, all based on their race. Interracial relationships and marriages were illegal, and perhaps most importantly, non-whites did not have a right to vote.
All these laws after 1948 had one purpose in mind, and that was to ensure that the 4 million whites in South Africa had all the resources, the wealth, the jobs, the mines concentrated in their hands.
The Race Classification Act put people in 4 different categories: white at the top, followed by Indian, colored or of mixed descent, and black at the bottom. And within those groups were subgroups, further segregating ethnic and tribal groups. A number of pseudo-scientific tests were used to classify individuals suspected of not being European. For example, the pencil test. This involved putting a pencil in an individual's hair. If the pencil fell to the floor, they passed the test and were considered white. If it stayed put, they were considered colored. Black South Africans were forced to carry identification at all times known as a passbook. Resistance to apartheid laws came in the form of mostly non-violent political protests. Together, freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Ahmed Kathrada started to play an important role for both the African and Indian National Congress parties. In 1952, they began a defiance campaign calling on people to purposely break apartheid laws in order to get arrested. People of color got onto white buses, used white toilets, and entered white areas. Their hope was that the high number of prisoners would cause the system to collapse. But it did not. Thousands ended up in jail. And in 1953, the Public Safety Act and Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed to impose even more severe penalties for demonstrating against the law. On March 21, 1960, a protest against the use of passbooks turned violent in the black township of Sharpeville, when police opened fire on unarmed protesters, leaving nearly 70 dead and 180 wounded, including children. A state of emergency was declared nationwide, and opposition political parties, including the ANC, were banned, forcing many to move their fight underground.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
By 1964, most resistant leaders, including Mandela, were sentenced to life imprisonment following the infamous Rivonia trials, which drew international attention. Eventually, a tide of global pressures put the government in a difficult position.
The world was changing. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and that was a major movement. There was increased calls for the divestment of companies from South Africa. There was a global movement to boycott South Africa.
Coupled with unrest within the country and the continued armed struggle, negotiations began between the ANC and the National Party. Slowly, apartheid began to dismantle. In 1990, at the age of 71, Nelson Mandela was released from prison.
I stand here before you, not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people.
Elections were held 4 years later, with the ANC winning 62% of the vote and Nelson Mandela becoming president. The people of South Africa won their country back, and apartheid was abolished.
Never, never, and never again shall it be
that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
Are modern Jews descendants of the tribe of Judah, one of the sons of Jacob? Are European Jews really Gentiles whose ancestors converted to Judaism? The facts are clear now that most of those who call themselves Jews are not descendants of Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel, and therefore have no claim to the land of Palestine. The October 29, 1996 New York Times, in an article entitled "Scholars Debate Origins of Yiddish and the Migrations of Jews," states, the Eastern European Jews were not really Semitic, that they were largely descended from the Turkish Khazars, who converted to Judaism in medieval times. Therefore, modern Jews have no blood link to the biblical Israelites. Jewish historians have established that at least 90% of all Jews come from a Turkish mix of people and are largely sourced from the Khazar kingdom. The Jewish scholar Arthur Koester provided overwhelming evidence in his book titled The 13th Tribe, showing that in the 8th century, Khazaria, which was greatly made up of the Turkish mixed people known as Khazars, converted to their national religion of Judaism, which was based on the Babylonian Talmud. He states in his book that the Khazar Empire, which in the Dark Ages became converted to Judaism, Khazaria was finally destroyed by Genghis Khan and his Mongol hordes, but evidence indicates that the Khazars themselves migrated to Poland and formed a Western Jewish community. They eventually migrated to other places like Germany and Russia.
Christian churches and the general public have been deceived. Many Jewish historians are now admitting that they are not the true Hebrews of the Bible. And how can they be returning to the land of Israel when they were never there to begin with?
The goal of creating a homeland for Jews seemed like a noble pursuit in 1897, when the Zionist movement became officially established. However, their dream of returning to Palestine has become a nightmare of violence, and there is no end in sight. Worse yet, the concept that Palestine is their homeland has turned out to be a tragic mistake. These white-skinned Ashkenazi Jews are not descendants of the original Jews of Palestine. There were no white people in Africa or Palestine 2,000 years ago. The medieval Europeans assumed that Jesus Christ, his mother, and the other original Jews looked just like the Europeans, which is why you can find Jesus with blue eyes and green eyes, and why his mother has such white skin.
Hey guys, the gig is up. I'm not the real Jesus. As a matter of fact, the fella's name wasn't even Jesus. He had a Hebrew name. There wasn't a letter J until a few hundred years ago. With that being said, I have fooled the whole world into the biggest sham of all time. The name and identity of the real fella has been taken over by me. There are thousands of paintings of Jesus, and they don't even come close. Jesus was the creation of the Roman Catholic Church, which served to replace the real fella, who probably looked more like Morgan Freeman. But who cares? The truth doesn't matter, as long as you pay your tithes. Gotcha.
Now I got another question for you. Didn't these so-called Jews reject the Messiah? So as a whole, the Jews do not accept Yeshua, the one that the world called Jesus, as the Messiah. And according to the scriptures, the curses of Deuteronomy 28 should be evident in their lives. But instead, they are the richest, most powerful people on the face of the earth. I leave you with this scripture. I know thy works, tribulation, and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them that say that they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Who call themselves Jews? Who worship in the synagogue? I rest my case.